Joining us for this event today. I'm just going to give it about 30 seconds here, but just so that everyone can get logged in and set up, and then we'll dive in for the event. All right, let's rock and roll. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Sam Ricketts. I'm a co-founder and senior advisor with Evergreen Action. I'm going to be your host for today's festivities. We're really excited to be with you today, for everyone for joining us to talk about a new paper released by Evergreen Action and the Natural Resource Defense Council, NRDC, that's titled Powering Towards 100% Clean Power. This paper provides a roadmap for how the Biden administration and state leaders can and must build upon the progress of the last 2 years with bold action over the next 2 years to put us on a path to 100% clean, carbon-free electricity by 2035, and especially how President Biden must use executive action to make progress towards this critical goal that he has set for the entire country. We'll get into the report findings in a little bit, including the need to move from approximately 40% clean power today to 80% clean power by 2030 to cut carbon pollution and stay on path towards 100% clean electricity, the critical importance of the Clean Air Act and standards limiting carbon pollution from power plants, the role of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the need for efficient, effective, and equitable implementation of new federal investments passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course, the leadership and continued leadership that we're going to need to see from governors and state leaders in building the clean energy economy. But before we get into all that, let's first meet the terrific speakers that are joining us for today's event. First of all, Senator Tina Smith is a fierce advocate for Minnesotans and a champion for a clean energy future in the United States Senate. She's a member of the Senate Agriculture, Banking, Health, and Indian Affairs Committees. She has authored legislation to establish a federal clean energy standard to achieve 100% carbon-free electricity. And of course, she was a leading champion for strong climate provisions passed in the Inflation Reduction Act by Congress and signed by President Biden last summer. Senator Smith, we are honored to have you back on the pod with Evergreen. Thanks so much for all of your leadership in the Senate. Thanks for joining us here today.
Well, thank you, Sam. I'm delighted to be with all of you, my friends. I want to thank Evergreen and NRDC for this terrific paper. And I want to invite everybody on this pod to please join me in wishing Sam Ricketts a happy birthday, because today is his birthday. I know Dr. Stokes is interested in celebrating as well, as I'm sure everyone is. So happy birthday, Sam. I think I made you blush a little bit, so I feel that my work is done here today.
A little bit. Thank you, Senator. Thanks for being here, and thank you for that. Very kind of you. Next up, I want to introduce Manish Bapna, who's president and CEO of NRDC, an organization that's been working to safeguard the planet since 1970 and one of Evergreen's most valued partners. Manish has served as an executive at the World Resources Institute and at the Bank Information Center. He was a senior economist at the World Bank, and throughout his career, he has been a champion for sustainable development strategies that are equitable, that are durable, and that are scalable. Manish, thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of this event. Thanks for all your great partnership on this paper and all of your work.
Delighted to be here. Privileged to be partnering with Evergreen on this incredibly important report. To be here with Senator Smith for your leadership that has been so indispensable to get us to where we are today. So thank you. I'm tempted to start singing Happy Birthday, Sam, but I'm going to spare you that for now, but maybe later in the program. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up, Dr. Leah Stokes is an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara. She's author of the award-winning book, Short Circuiting Policy, and was recently named to Time Magazine's Time 100 and Business Insider's Climate Action 30 lists. Leah co-hosts the climate podcast, A Matter of Degrees. She advises Rewiring America, and she's also served as an early advisor to Evergreen Action. Leah, thanks so much for joining. Just to out you as well, I think your birthday was 8 days ago. You're 8 days older than me, I believe it is. So happy belated birthday to you too.
On that note, did you know that I am approximately 1 week older than Sam Ricketts in a birth year sense as well, meaning I am the older sibling in this relationship. That's all I'm trying to say. So yes, it's always wonderful to be working with Sam. He's really the force behind so much awesome stuff that's happened. You know, people might not know this, but Sam was a really big author of the Inslee climate plans, which we know have had such an indelible long-term impact, including on the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're not just celebrating Sam for his birthday, but also for his work. So let's just embarrass Sam today. That's the theme of the event.
All right. All right. Thank you, Leah. Moving along, Lissa Lynch is the Climate and Clean Energy Federal and Legal Director at NRDC, where she leads a team of lawyers using regulatory and legal advocacy tools to advance climate, clean air, and clean energy policy. Lissa, thank you for all your good work on this paper. Thanks for all of your hard work and your partnership, and welcome to this event.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm not going to embarrass you any further. So.
Thank you very much for your mercy. Well, without further, a couple other ground rules I want to get into just before we dive in. Number one, we're going to spend the first 35 minutes of this event hearing from the panelists, and then we'll save the last 10 or so minutes for Q&A from the audience. So if you have a question you'd like to ask the group, please drop it in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll try to get it answered for you. Number two, we're going to, the good senator is going to need to leave a bit early, about 4:30. So we're going to pause and send her off around that time. So pardon if I interrupt any panelists around then, but it's for everyone's awareness. And then finally, we're going to be talking about this new paper here together today, which I think has already been dropped into the chat. But if you want to read it, please take a look at the link and download it, and you can follow along even as we talk. So without further ado, and nor any further embarrassments, let us dive right into the subject at hand here. First of all, Senator Smith, thank you again for being here. Before we talk about what President Biden, what state lawmakers need to do next, let's talk about what's just occurred and your leadership and others in the Senate and the House and the administration who've just achieved transformational change the last couple of years. So last summer, Congress passed and President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, investing nearly $400 billion in projected spending, perhaps much more, in this clean energy transition. And as someone who is a tireless advocate for that legislation from start to finish, can you tell us about how the Inflation Reduction Act moves the ball forward for clean electricity in America?
Well, thanks, Sam. So, as I was thinking about talking with all of you today, it sort of dawned on me that here we are in January of 2023. In January of 2021, I think I was sitting down with Leah and others to think about how we could take what was the clean energy standard, clean electricity standard legislation that I had and transform it into a clean electricity payment plan. And then a year ago, we were talking about what we were going to do next when it looked like we weren't going to be able to get any climate legislation through the Senate at all. And so to just be here today, to be thinking about this transformational investment, the largest investment in history, to provide incentives for moving us towards our goal of 80% clean power by 2030 is really incredible. Our goal here is to lead the way towards reducing emissions, lowering energy costs for Americans, and in so doing, put us in a leadership position around the technology and innovation for a clean energy future that is creating jobs and opportunity for Americans. That is sort of what this is all about. The strategy is to use the tools that we have, which are tax incentives and grants and loans, to spur and fuel and push this energy transition, which is happening, to push it so that it happens faster. And so as your incredible charts in the paper you'll be talking about later show, the line towards emissions reductions is steeper and happens quicker, which is what we need to do. And the strategy is, one, to clean up the power sector as quickly as we can. And then second of all, to electrify everything that we can so that it is powered with that clean power. And then third, to advance energy efficiency through the economy in all the ways that we can, because energy that is not used is emissions saved and is highly powerful in its own right. So that's the strategy. It's around electrification, it's around clean power, and it's around energy efficiency. what these incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act do are to, one, put clear tax credits towards renewable energy production and investment for solar and wind and other renewables. I don't know if my good friend Michael Noble, who leads Minnesota's Fresh Energy, is on this call, a longtime leader on clean energy, but Michael describes it really clearly as he says, basically, this puts wind, solar, and batteries on a 30% sale for moving us forward. And of course, that's good for consumers. And it is also good for the folks that are trying to figure out how to put together the capital investment to be able to make those, make those investments. And by the way, this is really important. It provides direct pay for nonprofits who otherwise have a much harder time taking advantage of tax credits. They have to bring in all sorts of outside financiers in order to make that happen. And that's much less efficient use of those dollars. So you've got those tax incentives and tax credits. You have a really formidable and powerful set of loan guarantees, primarily through the Department of Energy, which are all about supporting clean energy, new technology, and about enhancing that, again, that kind of innovation curve on clean power. And then you have really important pieces of legislation that often don't get as much attention in the ag sector and rural economy sector, which is going to have a huge impact as well. And all of this is going to lower energy costs, put us high on that innovation curve, and it's going to include public health, especially for those communities that have been hurt the worst by fossil fuel pollution, Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, poor communities. So it is that, in a nutshell, is what the Inflation Reduction Act will accomplish in just a few short years, as long as we implement it, which is what we're here to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Senator Smith. One other question we've got for you, and we're going to talk a lot about the rest of the call about the federal steps that are going to be necessary, and that you just alluded to, effective and equitable implementation of these investments, some of the other regulatory tools the administration needs to use, but also there's the critical importance of state leadership, right? States have long led the charge in building clean electricity for the country. And one of the places that that's happening as we speak, really excitingly, is your home state in Minnesota. Where I think a clean energy standard is moving in the legislature even this week. Can you tell us a little bit about the exciting stuff happening in Minnesota at current?
Yeah, well, thank you, because I'm very excited. This is near and dear to my heart, the work that Minnesota is doing. Minnesota was one of 4 states in the country that has the triumvirate. It has a Democratic governor, House, and state Senate. And they have very rapidly moved forward a piece of legislation which puts into place a clean energy standard in Minnesota with high goals. They have passed it through the House. They are anticipating moving it through the Senate in the coming days, and the governor stands ready not only to sign this law, but also to make sure that it is implemented exceptionally well. And this is exactly the kind of local leadership that we need all around the country in order to hit our goals, as your report shows. And I also just want to note that the legislators that just recently won this election and the governor all campaigned on this. This is not something they just pulled out of their hat after they won the election. They said, if you elect us, this is what we will do. And I think that that is a powerful reminder of the popularity of advancing clean energy, because people get in Minnesota, clean energy is rural energy. Clean energy is about opportunity and, again, about lowering costs. So it's very exciting. I'm very proud of them. And I worked on this when I was lieutenant governor, so I have just a teeny bit of ownership for what they're working on.
That's awesome. That's really exciting. Thank you very much, Senator. Next up, I want to go to Manish with a question to you. As a leader of a major environmental organization, can you talk about how and why this report that we're talking about here today should galvanize climate action at both the federal and state level and nationwide?
Absolutely. And it's going to follow, I think, quite nicely what the senator mentioned. I mean, the report, it's a brilliant report. It shows not only that President Biden's climate goals for the power sector are achievable, but it provides one of the very first detailed roadmaps of how we get there. And the punchline is incredibly important. We don't need any magic bullets. We don't need new technologies. We have the tools. And the report lays out those tools. And perhaps the most important tool is enacting strong federal power plant standards by early next year. Dr. Stokes, Lissa are going to go into much greater detail on the how. So I wanted to take a moment and talk a little bit more about the why. And I think this is incredibly important because I think the country, the world, everyone is looking for a good economic growth and transformation story. And what we are seeing is that clean energy, the clean energy revolution, is a crucial part of a profound economic transformation story. If we were to just take a step back and think a little bit about what are some of the benefits of acting on climate, of advancing a clean energy revolution, we're starting to see those benefits become more visible and more compelling. Look at the jobs that we're talking about, 3.2 million jobs in the clean energy, clean transportation space already. UMass Amherst, many of you know, undertook a study that showed that the Inflation Reduction Act would add nearly 900,000 jobs per year for the next 10 years. If we look at the last 3 months of 2022, the American Clean Power Association quantified $40 billion of new investments in manufacturing facilities related to solar, wind, energy storage. We see the public health benefits, the significance of shifting from fossil fuels to clean energy, recognizing that those public health benefits, as the senator mentioned, will disproportionately support environmental justice communities, frontline communities, given the disproportionate public health burden that they face today. When we think about inflation and energy security, how we actually shift from energy sources that exhibit high price volatility. Solar, wind, renewable energy is the true form of energy independence. And then, of course, the carbon benefits, right? With IRA, with EJA, we're at 40 to 41% below 2005 levels by 2030. But with many significant steps as outlined in this report, there is still a credible path to get to 50 to 52%. And fundamental, the biggest step between where we are and where we need to be is precisely cleaning up the power sector. That's just on the benefit side. And the point here is also not to lose sight of the cost of inaction. 8 of the warmest years we have seen have happened since 2014. If you look at the damages we've seen from climate disasters in the past year, it's $165 billion in the United States. And we know US emissions have increased by 1.3%. So the point here, the benefits increasingly compelling on economic benefits, health benefits, climate benefits, and the costs are increasingly visible. And what this report does, it provides a detailed roadmap of how we build out a more clean, a more resilient, a more innovative clean power sector and clean energy future. And so the real challenge for us now is one of urgency and ambition. We don't have time. We need to move forward with all the recommendations immediately. Thank you, Sam.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manish. And thank you for highlighting and talking about how this is not only an agenda of transformation for the climate imperative of reducing carbon, but also cutting Americans' energy costs, creating good jobs, advancing environmental justice and health outcomes. Well, next up, I'd love to turn to Leah and Lissa to unpack get into the guts of the report, if you will. Leah, can you start by talking about some of the key findings throughout the entirety of the report? And maybe Lissa, can you talk about the critical role in particular of the Clean Air Act and standards to limit carbon pollution from new and existing plants? Let me turn it over to both of you, but Leah, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I just want to pick up on some of the themes that Manish and Senator Smith have raised. You know, it's so powerful to think back to 2021 when President Biden was inaugurated, and we were all so excited. And I know Senator Smith was right at the front of the line trying to figure out how to make sure we didn't lose this opportunity with Democratic control in both the House and the Senate, and a president who cared about climate in the White House. And, you know, there was a roller coaster along the way. There were moments where we lost really big plans and times when we had to pivot. And there were many days where I'm sure Senator Smith felt this way. I felt this way, where it felt like all was lost and we were going to get nothing. So the fact that people like Senator Smith worked so hard to get this bill over the finish line, I think I will never stop being grateful until I am dead about what was done this year. And I happened to be watching, because I don't know, I'm a weird person, C-SPAN the other day, and I was watching when the votes were happening on the Senate floor for the Inflation Reduction Act. And one thing I noticed was Senator Smith, after the last vote got called, just wandering around, hugging everybody with just deep, deep joy. And I just could really see how hard she worked to make that happen. So just huge gratitude. So what are we talking about here? Well, President Biden made a pledge to the American people, right? He said that he would cut carbon pollution in half by 50 to 52% this decade. Why does that matter? Why do we have to cut carbon pollution in half this decade vis-a-vis our 2005 pollution levels? Well, because scientists have said that if we want to limit warming globally to 1.5 degrees, we have to do that everywhere. So President Biden says, okay, the US is going to make its contribution to that global goal. And keep in mind, we've already warmed the planet by about 1.2 degrees. So we don't have a lot of time to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. One of the really important things that has to happen if we want to cut carbon pollution economy-wide is to clean up the electricity sector. Why? Because, as Senator Smith and Manish have both pointed out, clean electricity is the first linchpin. It's super important. When we have clean electricity, 100% clean electricity, we can use it to power our homes, our cars, even parts of heavy industry with that clean power, rather than using things like oil or fossil gas or coal, right? Fossil fuels. And so that is how we decarbonize about 3/4 of our current carbon pollution, with clean electricity plus electrification. And as Senator Smith pointed out, we can throw some energy efficiency on top to decrease the amount of energy we need to use. So electricity plus electrification is the path. This is the way. And so President Biden said that he wants to get the country to 100% clean power by 2035. This is a presidential pledge. And what is on the pathway to that? It's 80% clean power by 2030. So the Inflation Reduction Act gets us a lot of the way to that 80% clean power by 2030, but it doesn't get us all the way. So how do we make sure we're on track, not just for our carbon pollution reductions, but also for this clean electricity sector by 2030 and 2035? Well, what we have to do is we need EPA to act more quickly and more ambitiously when it comes to cleaning up the power sector. That's both for carbon emissions requirements under the Clean Air Act, and Lissa's going to get into this, as well as for traditional public health rules, things like mercury, for example, that we know we need to do to protect Americans' health, and that happen to have a side effect in terms of other kinds of pollution like carbon. So Lissa's going to get into exactly what needs to be happening at EPA. And I think one of the key points that Evergreen has been doing such a great job of pointing out, including yesterday in a story in the New York Times, is that the EPA is behind. It is not moving fast enough on these power plant rules or ambitious enough. So that's something we really need to see the EPA do. And I have empathy because, of course, the EPA has been gutted under the Trump administration. But this is absolutely critical. We need to see greater ambition from the agency. In addition, we need FERC to take action. This is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They have a lot of authority over things like transmission capacity that's going to be super important to connecting all that clean power into the grid. And I know this is a topic that Senator Smith has also really been championing. We need other agencies across the Biden administration to make sure that they implement the IRA and the IIJA as robustly, fastly, quickly, perfectly as possible, which will be hard. And importantly, that they make sure that these investments benefit workers as well as disadvantaged communities and communities of color and low-income communities. And they're really in line with the Justice 40 initiative. And finally, as we've started to talk about with Minnesota, we need more states to step up. Thankfully, last year that started to happen. We had lots of action out of, for example, California, Maryland, Connecticut, Massachusetts. I am hopeful we'll see more action this year out of Minnesota and Michigan. And I know that's something that Evergreen and NRDC and others like at Rewiring America are focused on. But we need states to keep pushing on the clean electricity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lissa to get into the weeds about some of the Clean Air Act policies that or regulations that EPA really needs to be focusing on.
Great. So one of the very exciting things in this report is some brand new power sector modeling. We've put out modeling before, and so have a number of other groups showing just what Leah was saying, that the IRA will lead to very significant power sector emission reductions by 2030, assuming it's implemented efficiently and effectively. And we talk a lot about that in the report. But there's still going to be a lot of work to do on other fronts beyond the IRA. It's not going to be enough on its own to achieve either that international commitment of 50 to 52% economy-wide reduction or President Biden's power sector targets, 100% clean by 2035 and 80% by 2030. So the good news is that our new modeling shows that we can very nearly reach that 2030 power sector target with the combination of the IRA and strong carbon pollution standards for both new and existing fired power plants. And so we've got this lovely slide of one of the graphics in the report. These results that we're showing here are not a foregone conclusion. They will only be achieved if EPA and President Biden act quickly and with pretty significant ambition to finalize truly strong carbon standards for both new and existing power plants. So what is going to make for a strong standard? First of all, EPA's got to be ambitious in setting the level of the standard. After last year's Supreme Court decision, EPA is a bit more constrained in what they consider for standard setting, but they've got options. And they have options that will enable them to set pretty tight limits on CO2 emissions based on what can be done inside the fence line, so to speak, at the power plants themselves. Those include carbon capture and sequestration or shifting to a lower carbon fuel. We know that those are not the ideal options, right? We want to be shifting toward renewable energy, but EPA is constrained and what they can do. And the great thing is that if they max out their ambition on the basis of, what can be done inside the fence line, those strong standards will actually drive a ton of renewable generation. So the modeling that we include in the report shows renewable and energy storage capacity tripling from 2022 to 2030 and quadrupling by 2035. So just enormous renewable energy. I have a flashing light on my screen, and I think we're about to lose the senator. So maybe I'll pause there.
Thank you, Lissa. Yeah, the great pause. I know we want to excuse Senator Smith, and I'll turn the microphone back over to you here, and Alyssa, in a second. But Senator Smith, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for all of your leadership on clean electricity and on climate solutions in the Senate. And thanks for coming back on the pod with Evergreen. And we look forward to continuing to champion or cheer on your leadership in the Senate. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And everyone, listen closely to how NRDC and Evergreen are talking about how we need to hold all of us accountable to make sure that the promise of the Inflation Reduction Act and the power that we have using executive action and state action can be realized. That's about accountability, and it's about having high standards, and it's exactly how we should be thinking about this problem. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Senator. Lissa, back to you.
All right, so where were we? We were talking about how to get to strong carbon standards. Okay, so first, got to max out ambition. EPA is constrained, but they can still do a lot on the basis of what's achievable inside the fence line at the plants themselves. And critically, that's just for the standard setting. Then that number is in place and the states have flexibility for how they want to build their state plans to comply. And the power companies themselves have flexibility for complying with that number. So a lot of opportunities to drive better, more strategic investments in renewable energy and away from dirty power. Second, strong standards need to cover all types of fossil fuel fired power plants, existing coal, and new and existing fossil gas plants. The importance of covering existing gas is one of the things that was shown in that graph and that's in the report. Standards that leave out existing gas, which we've labeled the moderate line in the report, can get us to about a 70% reduction by 2030. And that's good, but ambitious standards on all sources gets us to about 77% by 2030. That is pretty darn close to 80%. That's like really, really good news. The third thing that EPA really needs to get right is the timeline. We need to get these rules finalized no later than early 2024, and they need to be implemented as soon as possible in order to maximize the emission reductions that we're seeing by 2030. So setting strong Section 111 standards for carbon pollution and covering all fossil fuel plants is the most critical step that the administration can take to keep us on the path to 100% clean energy. And there's lots more to do on climate and energy, obviously, at the federal and state level, which we're going to keep talking about. But as Leah mentioned, I wanted to just take a moment to discuss some of the other really important air and water quality rules that are going to be needed to address public health harming pollution from fossil fuel fired power plants. There's a couple of really big ones coming up. The mercury and air toxic standards for coal-fired power plants. We're expecting the EPA to issue a proposal this year to strengthen those standards to better protect children and other vulnerable populations from hazardous air pollutants emitted from burning coal, right? Super important, going to be a big fight. We're going to need all the support that we can get in order to push EPA to make those as strong as possible. EPA also recently proposed to strengthen the national ambient air quality standards for fine particle pollution. That's the super damaging soot pollution that harms your lungs when you breathe it in. They're going to need some pressure to finalize the strongest NAAQS standards possible there. And there's a whole suite of rules under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, to address all the forms of air and water pollution from fossil fuel fired power plants. There's a ton more details in the report, and I'd really encourage folks to take a look because those are all obligations, not just authorities, but obligations that EPA's got to regulate those harmful pollutants under their existing statutory authority. And each one of those individual rules is really critical to protecting the communities that have to live by nearby dirty power generation. So I will leave the EPA section there and turn it back over to Leah for the rest of the solution.
Well, I just want to say that Lissa is really a masterclass in understanding the EPA and how strong it should be. I've learned a lot from her. There's so much of her wisdom in this report and other people's wisdom at NRDC too. So it's really big blessing to have her working on these issues. And the fact is, we need the EPA to get going on these standards. These standards need to be strong. They need to be covering everything possible. For example, with the soot standard that recently got proposed, that's not finalized. There's still an opportunity for folks to give comment. And a friend of mine was pressuring me to give comment on that the other day. So even I should be giving comment on those standards. We all should. This is something that any person can do. We can give comment into these rules. And those were not as strong as many groups were hoping that they would be, that they didn't cover, for example, different time periods, the daily and the weekly and the yearly time periods for that particular rule. So as Lissa was saying, when it comes to power plants, we can't just have the Biden administration put out a proposed rule just for existing coal plants and not existing gas plants. We have to also have them put out a rule for new proposed fossil fuel power plants, right? We need all of our bases covered here. And if you're interested in figuring out where are we at with all these EPA rules, Evergreen has a super clear graphic that shows you, it's like a little report card. Hopefully it can be dropped in the chat right now for everyone, but you can see that unfortunately we're behind. The Biden administration is behind on where they need to be on a lot of these rules. And we need to keep the pressure up so that not only are these rules happening in a timely fashion, but that they're also ambitious. In addition, We need FERC to be doing more. FERC is obviously in a bit of a transition moment right now, but we need them to be stepping up, particularly on transmission planning. And in this report, we go into detail. It's not a long and boring report for the sake of being such. It's because there are really specific recommendations that we wanted to put forward. So we need the regional transmission planning process to be improved. We need to streamline the interconnection process. What this means is that there's a lot of projects out there for wind and solar that are great, right? But they can't connect to the grid. Right now, the average time period is 3.7 years to get through the interconnection queue. That's not functional. If we want to build all the clean energy as fast as possible, we got to fix that. And we need to make sure that there's market parity. In parts of our country where we have restructured electricity markets, we have to make sure that renewables are being treated fairly, that we're not subsidizing fossil fuels in the case of, for example, the MOPR rule, and that we're making sure that we're giving full value to the renewables. So FERC can play a really strong role there. And then finally, states are really important. We've got to get more states like Minnesota is currently stepping up to do 100% clean electricity standards. We need public utility commissions and utilities to be doing more. I want to plug a recent Sierra Club report that I did. It's called The Dirty Truth About Utility Climate Pledges. And basically what we looked at was, what are utilities doing? And we found that they are not moving with the ambition that's necessary. And the Inflation Reduction Act should be causing every single utility to rip up its integrated resource planning processes. This is their plans for what they want to build. If you wrote a plan in January 2022 and you still think that's your plan in January 2023, you are not living in reality. And I want to give a shout out to a great person at NRDC, which is Sam Krasnow, fabulous person who contributed to this report. And he has told me that some utilities are being smart enough to rip up their plans. So we need everybody, all the utilities and all the public utility commissions who are supposed to oversee these utilities to say, hey guys, get with the program, check out all these amazing new tax credits or these direct pay credits for co-ops and munis to actually do the right thing. We have to make sure we're doing the right thing on environmental justice and energy justice. The fact is that so many of these programs either include a direct amount for disadvantaged communities that is, along the lines of 40%, or the Biden administration under its executive order has said that it needs to be implemented in that way. And we are blessed to have in the Department of Energy, for example, Shalonda Baker doing an amazing job, implementing that Justice 40 initiative to make sure that the DOE programs are actually lifting people out of poverty, redistributing wealth in this country, that we don't just have our energy policy going to wealthy people who owe the federal government taxes, but that it's going to all kinds of people. And that will be a huge change. And finally, we got to make sure that we're taking full advantage of all the different buckets. There's a lot of little truffles, sometimes I'd like to think, buried in the IRA, things underground, right? There are things, for example, to help utilities retire coal plant debt. We need to make sure that, for example, the Loan Program Office at the DOE, that utilities are thinking about how can they actually make this transition. There are so many resources at the federal government now, but we need utilities to actually step up and use them. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sam Ricketts, who I think has got another question for Manish.
That's awesome. Thank you, Leah. And in particular, all the truffles that Leah mentioned are all part of the report. So I hope you'll all go to the link that we provided here in the chat and download the report and read about every individual truffle. I do have a question for Manish very briefly, because I do want to turn to we're getting some great Q&A from participants who tuned in. But Manish, very briefly, you worked a lot at the international stage, and we're talking here about domestic climate action to reduce carbon pollution here at home. Can you just talk very briefly about what that means in terms of the global audience, the global stage, and this global challenge?
Yeah, no, absolutely. U.S. Climate leadership, I think we all recognize, is absolutely critical to unlocking global climate ambition. The United States, largest historical emitter, widely seen rightfully as the most powerful country. And the way in which the United States leans in on climate plays a very important role in shaping how other countries react. And that's especially true at this particular point in time when the global headwinds on climate are actually blowing quite strongly. The Russian invasion in Ukraine, the economic slowdown, if not recession, that we're seeing globally, and the consequent impacts in terms of inflation, in terms of debt, creating a real reprioritization of climate on the global stage. And the reality is, when one looks back at the last few decades, the United States has been a climate laggard, not a climate leader. The United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. With the Paris Agreement, withdrew and then rejoined. And even now, there isn't necessarily a widely perceived credible path that the United States can meet what, quite honestly, is still a fairly modest climate goal of reducing emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. So that is where and why this moment is so incredibly important. President Biden comes in, rejoins the Paris Agreement, but as Leah mentioned, put forward a good goal given where the United States was, 50 to 52%. Second year of the administration, works with Congress to pass the most consequential climate legislation that we've seen. But this third year is going to be absolutely critical. It's about implementing that legislation, putting forward strong federal standards on power plants, on vehicles, on the other areas that Leah and Lisa mentioned. And as part of that, I think the international community wants to see some of the technological cost savings that this investment will unlock shared more equitably around the world. And another piece I would say is international climate finance, one of the big thorny issues that still remains a big challenge between the United States and much of the developing world. Look, the climate math is unforgiving. The United States is 11% of emissions, necessary but not sufficient to solving the global climate problem. But fortunately, the economic story is even more compelling. And that's why, following the recommendations that have been put forward in this report, it's a good economic story, and it is essential to solving the climate problem.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Manish. And Lisa and Leah, thank you also for going over the paper findings. With that, we've got a number of good questions here from folks who've tuned in, and I want to start turning to them. I think this first one, Lisa, I'll throw maybe the answer your way to start here. A great question that's come in from Robert Semple is, can you talk about, and are you confident that rules conforming to the West Virginia v. EPA decision can really make a difference? And can you just talk about that in the post-West Virginia v. EPA world?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a great question. A lot of the coverage following the decision last summer in West Virginia versus EPA was pretty gloomy, and we felt pretty gloomy. But one of the things that we have tried to convey and continue to believe is EPA is constrained, but they are not, they've still got a lot of room to run. And so what the Supreme Court essentially did in West Virginia versus EPA was it struck down the approach that EPA used in the Clean Power Plan, where they set the standards based on what could be achieved outside the fence line, essentially shifting dirtier generation to cleaner generation, retiring coal plants and replacing them with clean energy. And the court said, that's too far. You can't do that under the Clean Air Act. But what they left open was EPA's authority to set standards kind of the more traditional way, based on what they called technology that causes the source to operate more cleanly. So that leaves EPA with sort of the limited range of possible technologies that can be, bolted on, affixed to, installed at the plant to reduce the plant's emissions. Those technologies for fossil-fired EGUs, electric generating units, the part of the power plant that's actually, regulated, are carbon capture and sequestration, shifting to a cleaner fuel than the one that they're currently burning, or improving the operating efficiency at the plant. And of those, none of them are our ideal, right? None of them are what we want to see in this broader energy transition that we're talking about here. But what they allow is for the level of stringency to be fairly significant. And all EPA does is they set that level and they say, you going forward can only emit X amount of pollution per year, per megawatt hour, however they're going to do it, based on that, what that technology could achieve. And once they derive that number, Then the states start their process for existing plants to determine how they're going to implement it. The utilities look at that number and say, well, should we comply? Should we retrofit with CCS or co-fire with a cleaner fuel? Or should we just retire and invest in cleaner, cheaper, renewable energy, given all these tax credits? So there's a lot of decision-making that comes after the setting of the standard. And we're pretty confident that the Supreme Court's decision in West Virginia leaves a fair amount of room for setting fairly ambitious standards that will drive a lot of emission reductions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lissa. Next question, would love to maybe Leah, throw this one your way, from Eli Finichel, which is, as someone who works in the Massachusetts State Senate, wondering if there are any greenhouse gas reducing climate change fighting policies that aren't being advanced enough in state houses and that need to be filed or really advanced at the state level. You want to talk about that one?
Well, I know there's a lot of excitement about doing more in Massachusetts this year, given the election. So I've been talking to some folks in Massachusetts about ideas. You know, we need to keep cleaning up the power sector in all the different states faster. We've seen some states ratchet up their clean electricity standards and particularly put in interim targets that are sooner. Some of the early 100% clean electricity standards were like 2050 or 2045, right? And those are great, don't get me wrong, but they're also fairly far in the future. So what about, for example, putting an interim target that you want to get to 80% by 2030, or you want to do 90% by 2035? That's what California did last year, actually. So that's something that I think that a state like Massachusetts could consider. I'd also say, in addition to moving faster on the electricity sector, we've also alluded to electrification here. And in some of these New England states or Midwestern states, we have a fair amount of homes that are, for example, still running on delivered fuels, on fuel oil, things like propane. And we could, for example, work on incentive programs at the state level that electrify those kinds of homes, including in district geothermal, something that's being done in upstate New York, for example. So how can we think about getting heat pumps into homes that are on delivered fuels? That's a great policy, because not only does it, deal with greenhouse gases and carbon pollution and also conventional air pollution, it also helps with energy burden, because as Manish has talked about, energy prices are through the roof right now. And for folks that are on delivered fuels, I mean, they could be paying thousands of dollars more in their heating costs. And so heat pumps are actually a particularly beneficial tool for those kinds of communities. And Maine, for example, has a program, Efficiency Maine, and you may know Maine is a relatively cold state in this fair country of America, and they have a heat pump program that's actually been wildly successful. So looking at what Efficiency Maine has been doing, thinking about maybe doing a targeted program for delivered fuel homes, those are things that I'd say. We've also, of course, seen some states move forward on more electric school buses. That's something that's been done at the federal level. But what we haven't seen, and I would love to see Massachusetts do, is electrify the school buildings themselves, right? So how do we get rid of gas burning in our schools and actually turn them into electric facilities? That's great, because it includes both heating and air conditioning, and more schools need air conditioning and they don't have them. This is something that New York City has recently pledged. Mayor Adams has said he's going to start doing that. There's actually some schools in New York City that still run on delivered fuel, on fuel oil. Can you believe it? Oh my God. So, I would say electrifying schools is something that we didn't get out of the IRA or the IIJA, despite folks' great effort. And it's something that state legislature could totally champion. So those are some of my ideas off the top of my head. And I would say Evergreen is in the business of trying to figure out what to do in states. So you can always go bother Sam Ricketts about this. And also Rewiring America, where I work, is thinking a lot about how to electrify states. So, we are open for business to help state legislators achieve their wildest dreams and pass climate bills.
Awesome. Thank you, Leah. Folks, you may have noticed that it's 4:49, so we've already gotten a little bit past our set time of 4:45, but I know Lissa and Manish have got a little bit more time. Leah has to get across the campus to teach students her actual day job.
Statistics. I have to go teach statistics. Can you believe it? It's terrible.
We may lose Leah. She may need to skip out of here in just a second, but we can keep going with it. If you can go with us, we can go with you, folks. So stick around. We got a couple other questions. Maybe we want to answer at least one more. Manish, if I throw this one your way, A question from Zach Hale from S&P. The New York Times published a great story yesterday from Lisa Friedman, suggesting that a lot of the rule writing delays at EPA, which we've talked about here today, could be due to staff shortages that date back to the previous administration. And can you talk about or offer even or talk about that in context with these rule changes, the rules that we need to see? How is that challenge affecting the agency? Are there potential solutions to that? How does the agency deal with advancing these rules even while they've come under some constraints?
No, great question, and it was a great piece in the Times yesterday. I want to answer that in two ways. One, I just want to say, we've been talking a little bit about the Supreme Court ruling stopping these constraints that may undercut EPA's authority. I just want to underscore what the IRA does to strengthen EPA's authority for just a moment, because the tax incentives, the public funding is going to buy down the very costs of those technologies, those measures that the EPA standards are likely to be based upon. And so it does make the economic argument for what can be reasonably expected much, much more attractive than would be the case otherwise. So those IRA tax incentives, public funding, hugely important. And in addition to that, the IRA specifies that the EPA needs to issue new power plant standards that take into account those IRA incentives as well. So it amends the Clean Air Act in order to provide that mandate to actually update the power plant standards in light of the incentives. So that's just important to take note. In terms of the staffing constraints, a few things. One, clearly we need to see what we can do to support EPA in filling a backlog of hiring, as long as they stay away from NRDC, and I suppose Evergreen as well. We would be fine with that, but help them support around hiring. The other second kind of point, I think we as the kind of NGO research community need to do everything that we can to help them build the evidence base that they need for strong, stringent standards. So as this comes out, what we can do to help marshal the evidence that they need that is kind of durable in a sense of being able to set strong rules, critically important. And the third thing is not just staffing within the EPA, but how the coordination can be strengthened, improved, expedited between different parts within the administration is critically important. And that's where OIRA and the new leadership in OIRA is going to be an important part of it. So there's probably a multi-pronged response to how we actually address some of these staffing challenges at EPA.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Manish. Well, one last question we've got with a couple minutes left from Emma Dumaine at E&E. Manish or let's say if either of you want to jump in here. Her question is, while the focus is here in this paper largely on what agencies and the administration can do with existing authority, is there more that Congress can be doing, or we expected to be doing, to help? Do either of you want to jump in on that one?
Sam, you can answer some questions too. It's your birthday.
Well, I will say, I mean, it's another good question, right? Congress just passed a lot of really important things we need to see the administration go take action on and implement well. With that, a lot of important things that'll unpack more ambition and more clean energy transformation in utilities, at the state level, the local level. I would say from the initial inklings, from the initial signals from Congress, in particular the House Republicans, there's not a lot of confidence one might put in meaningful reform moving forward. But as we point out in the report, there's many things that Congress has not yet attended to, and certainly their job is not done. In the future, we're going to need Congress to revisit things like a clean electricity standard or clean electricity performance program like Senator Smith talked about and one which she led the last couple of years. They're going to see that need to attend to things like transmission planning and transmission permitting reform, things like a transmission investment tax credit. There's absolutely a role for Congress to move forward. I think most importantly, right now, we're going to need to see them continue to fund agencies, continue to not screw up or not get in the way of what needs to happen inside the administration right now, which is robust, equitable, efficient implementation. And so I'll take that one on Congress, which is, critically important role. It's going to need to play more of a role in the future. Right now, let's focus on using the tools we've got. Most importantly, President Biden moving forward with robust executive action in these next 2 years, starting with, but not limited to, robust carbon pollution standards for new and existing power plants to drive forward this transition to 100% clean electricity. Okay, well, I think that covers it as it comes to questions. And I know we've gone a little over our scheduled time. Lissa or Manish, is there anything else you'd like to conclude with before we move to wrap?
Lissa, you want to go first?
I would just love to encourage, I thank you all for joining. I see a bunch of questions in the chat. It's a little chaotic to try and, read the chat and answer questions and, speak, but I would encourage folks to reach out to the team, from which you got this invite, and we're happy to continue to talk about this. I would also really encourage folks to flip through the report. It's very long. It's very detailed, but that's for a reason. And it's because there are just so many things that can be done that need to be done at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. And so I hope that this report will serve as a good resource for folks in the states, for folks on the ground, for folks in the media, to be able to, flip through and see, well, what do I want to encourage FERC to do? What do I want to encourage my state legislature to do? And then, please reach out to the team if you'd like to continue to discuss, because I know we could keep talking about this for hours. So thanks.
The only thing I would add, cleaning up the power sector is absolutely fundamental to the United States meeting its 2030 climate goal and decarbonizing the economy. Cleaning up the power sector, there's no single one thing that one does. It is a jigsaw puzzle. And what this report does is spotlights all the different pieces in that puzzle in a very clear and crisp way. And what we need to do now is marshal the momentum and the energy to move forward on all those pieces with the urgency that it requires. And so just a huge congratulations to the report authors for putting such a clear kind of roadmap forward for all of us to follow. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Manish. Thank you very much, Lissa. With that, I do want to just echo Manish's comments about all the report authors, obviously Lissa and Dr. Stokes, but also want to recognize Charles Harper, Sam Krasnow, Amanda Levin, Danny Schulman, Jeff Slyfield, and Christy Walsh. And then I do just pick up the point that Lissa mentioned, especially anyone from the press, reporters who were on here and didn't get your questions answered. Please feel free to reach out to the comms teams at Evergreen or NRDC. Evergreen, that it's Holly Burke, Holly at evergreenaction.com. NRDC, that's Jake Thompson, J Thompson at nrdc.org. Please feel free to reach out to them. Please be in touch with organizations. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in this report and a lot of action we're going to need to see from federal and state lawmakers. We look forward to working with all of you to drive those transformations forward. So thanks all for joining today. Thanks to NRDC and Evergreen participants in this. Thanks to Senator Tina Smith. And we'll see you all again on the next one.